Welcome to Echoed Stories. No long intros today, just a story about how fast a life can fall apart. Listen, I work 12-hour shifts, 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., day in and day out. It is not just a job, it is a slow, grinding marathon for survival every single morning when the alarm goes off at 5. My body feels like it is made of lead. Every joint, every muscle protests against the coming day, but I get up. I put on those heavy, steel-toed boots, and I go back to the floor. I am surrounded by the deafening, rhythmic roar of heavy machinery, the stinging smell of ozone, burnt metal, and a layer of industrial grease that feels like it has become a permanent part of my skin. By the time I punch that clock at the end of the shift, my brain feels like it has been scrubbed raw with a wire brush. I am not just tired, I am hollow. When I drive home, my hands often cramp on the steering wheel, not from stress, but from the pure, raw, physical strain of a man who earns every single cent with his sweat. All I ever wanted, all I ever dreamed of during those long, lonely hours on the assembly line, was to walk through my front door, kick off those boots, and just exist in the silence of my own home. But lately, the silence in my home has been replaced by a poison, and that poison has a name: Mark. Mark called himself a family friend, but to me, he was a parasite. He was a man with soft, manicured hands, a guy who probably never held anything heavier than an expensive espresso or the latest iPhone. He was always there, sitting at my kitchen table, drinking the coffee I paid for, telling my wife, Sarah, endless, empty stories about his visionary business ventures and global networking. Sarah would sit across from him, her eyes wide, nodding like he was some kind of prophet. When I would walk in, covered in the dirt and oil of a real day's work, she would look at me with a mix of pity and annoyance, like I was some clumsy shadow that had accidentally stumbled into their intellectual sanctuary. "You just don't understand, honey," she would tell me at night, while I lay there, trying to stop my legs from shaking. "Mark is so intellectually stimulating. He helps me see the world beyond this small town. And you just come home and collapse. You are interested in nothing but your tools and your sleep." I stayed quiet for months. I swallowed the insults like a bitter pill because I actually believed her. I thought I was the problem. I thought my exhaustion had turned me into a boring, hollow shell of a man, and that I was failing her because I couldn't discuss the nuances of modern art after a double shift on the line. But I was wrong. I was not the problem. I was just the only one in that house with open eyes. Even if they were bloodshot from fatigue, the breaking point didn't come with a scream. It came with a click. I had forgotten my garage keys one Tuesday, and I came home 2 hours early. I walked through the front door, moving quietly because my boots were already off, and then I heard it. Laughter. It wasn't just a laugh. It was that specific, flirtatious giggle Sarah used to save only for me. Back when we first met, the sound was coming from our bedroom. I didn't rush in. I didn't break down the door. I just stood there in the hallway, feeling the cold air from the vent on my face. I turned around, walked back to my car, and sat there for an hour, watching the birds in the trees. In that hour, something in me shifted. You know how a heavy gear jams, and then it snaps, and starts spinning with a terrifying, destructive force. That was me. It was a cold, clinical, calculated rage. I realized then that simply throwing her out wasn't enough. They had been treating me like an ATM, like a servant in my own castle. They thought I was too simple to notice. Well, it was time to show them exactly how a simple man handles a broken machine. For the next 2 weeks, I became an actor. I was the perfect, clumsy, tired husband. I was even quieter than usual. I let them think I was completely oblivious, a work drone with no soul. But while they were whispering behind my back, I was dismantling their world, piece by piece. I started by digging into Mark's business. It took me 2 nights of secret, late-night searching to find the truth. His global office was a tiny, rented studio apartment he hadn't paid for in 10 weeks. He was a professional drifter, a man-child living off the kindness of women who were bored with their lives. Then I looked at our bank accounts. Sarah had been preparing too. She had already moved nearly $12,000 into a separate account, money she thought I wouldn't miss because I was too busy with my tools. They were planning a self-discovery trip to Bali, a fresh start, funded entirely by my 12-hour shifts. In the heat and the noise, I didn't block the accounts immediately. I wanted them to feel the full weight of their betrayal. I wanted them to be at the very peak of their excitement, right at the edge of the cliff, before I cut the rope. Judgment Day was a Friday. They were set to fly out Saturday morning. That evening, Sarah was unusually affectionate. She made me a nice dinner. She purred about how much she appreciated my hard work. I almost gagged right there at the table, looking at her in that new red dress, a dress I knew she bought for Mark's eyes, not mine. "I'm going to spend the weekend at my mom's," she said softly. "You've been so stressed, honey, you need the house to yourself to just rest." "Sure, you're right, I do need to rest," I replied. I even managed a smile as soon as she left for Mark's place to pack. I went to work. I packed her entire life into black, heavy-duty trash bags. I didn't leave a single hairpin. Every dress, every pair of shoes, every piece of jewelry I had given her over the last 7 years. I didn't use suitcases. Those stayed in the closet. Parasites don't deserve luggage. Then, I made a phone call. I had contacted Mark's landlord earlier that week. The guy was a retired veteran who hated Mark as much as I did. I offered to pay the full back rent Mark owed, on one condition. His locks had to be changed, and his belongings had to be sitting on the curb by 8 p.m. on Friday night. The landlord didn't even hesitate. He said he'd be honored to help me out. At 9 p.m., I drove over to Mark's apartment. The curb was already littered with boxes and piles of cheap clothes. I pulled up, got out of my truck, and began throwing Sarah's trash bags onto the pile. When I knocked on the door, Mark opened it wearing a silk bathrobe, likely one she had bought him. Sarah was standing behind him, holding a glass of my expensive wine. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. You should have seen their faces. The transition from confusion to realization to pure, unadulterated terror. "Here is your life, Sarah," I said, my voice as flat and cold as a sheet of steel. "It's all here, in the bags, and as for you, Mark, your landlord told me your international headquarters has moved to the sidewalk. Better get to it before the rain starts, or the neighbors start picking through your trash." Sarah started to scream. She yelled about her rights, about our marriage, about how I was abusing her by throwing her out. "Rights?" I asked, stepping closer. "You mean the $12,000 you stole? I've already filed a fraud report with the bank, since it was a joint account and I can prove the intent to flee. They've frozen the funds. You aren't going to Bali, Sarah. You aren't going anywhere, except maybe a cheap motel, if Mark can find a few bucks in his pockets. But considering his credit score is lower than the temperature outside, I wouldn't count on it." The look of total defeat on Mark's face was the best thing I had seen in years. He wasn't a visionary anymore. He was just a guy in a bathrobe standing on a porch. Realizing his meal ticket had just been canceled, she tried to grab my arm. She started sobbing, telling me it was a temporary lapse in judgment, that she still loved me. I just looked at her. I didn't see my wife. I saw a defective component that had been ruining the entire machine. "The locks on the house have already been changed," I told her. "The divorce papers will be served to you at whatever curb you decide to sleep on tonight. Don't ever, ever come back." I turned my back on them and walked away. As I drove down the street, I saw Mark's life scattered on the concrete, cheap, pathetic, and broken. I took a deep breath, and for the first time in months, the tightness in my chest, the pain in my back, it just vanished. This isn't a story about a broken heart. It's a story about maintenance. Sometimes, to make an engine run right, you have to be willing to get your hands dirty and throw out the garbage that's clogging the system. It took me a while to find the leak, but now the machine, finally, runs smooth again.